What's good, everyone? This is Dr.Nii. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Docs Outside the Box. Remember, this podcast is a fusion of money, medicine, as well as pop culture. And today I'm going to be interviewing a doctor who's actually thriving in a non-clinical career path. And I think it's probably one of the career paths that I think a lot of physicians, a lot of medical professionals transition to. But over the last 6 to 7 years, we haven't featured anybody who's in this career path, all right? And the career path I'm talking about is the pharma industry, the pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of folks who are actually thriving, doing very well in this field. But if you go to Facebook, if you go to Reddit, if you go to a whole bunch of different areas on social media where people can talk and ask questions, this is probably one of the number one fields that people have questions about. How do they get into it? How do they network? How do you find someone? What's the daily life like? And yeah, like I said before, we haven't featured anyone who's in this field, who's thriving in this field. But in this episode, you're going to get introduced to my next guest, who is Dr. Narissa Kreher. She is formerly trained as a pediatric endocrinologist. She also has an MBA from Northeastern University. And currently right now, if you're watching me on YouTube, you see my fingers right now. She is a chief medical officer of a biotech company, and she transitioned into biotech, into the pharma industry very early in her career, as you'll hear in this episode. And right now, we're talking about over 15 years of experience working in biotech, working in pharma, and this includes anywhere between small and large, private, as well as public companies. So she's got a lot of experience. And the other thing too is she's here to talk about her arc. She's here to talk about what it's like to be in pharma, what it's like to be a chief medical officer in this type of industry. But she's also really passionate about her work when you listen to her. And you'll see that she also has a passion for helping other physicians understand the possibilities for working in this industry. And that's what's up. And that's what I'm all about. So the three things that we're going to talk about in this episode, make sure you pay attention. The three objectives that you're going to learn is the common myths that docs believe about entering into the pharma industry, how to network your way into a job in pharma. That's really key. And then the many ways in which your skills as a physician and even as a resident, how many ways you can translate these skills into the job description that can get you a job into pharma. All right. So once again, we got Dr. Narissa Kreher with over 15 years of experience. She's here to talk about how she's thriving in the biotech pharm industry. Without further ado, let's get it. Dr. Narissa Kreher, MD, MBA, all the different alphabets at the end of your name, Welcome to Docs Outside the Box. How you doing?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here because we're going to go into a field, or you are dominating a field that we don't get a chance to talk about too much, right? And a lot of doctors, we hear about it, we kind of dip our toes into it, we prescribe medications all the time, or we work with pharmacists in the ED or different parts of a hospital setting or clinic setting, but we really don't understand how pharmaceuticals and how doctors can interact with each other, and also at the same time, how doctors can maybe transition into pharmaceuticals. We never hear about that really on this show. So I'm excited to have you here to talk about this. Now, before we jump into it, I just want to do a really quick introduction. You are trained formally as a pediatric endocrinologist, but you have a really strong background in the biotech, pharmacy, or pharmaceuticals industry. Currently, right now, as we speak, you are Chief Medical Officer at INCROWD Therapeutics, and there you oversee clinical and regulatory development strategy. You have also served on the startup's executive leadership team, and you are highly engaged with the board of directors and investors. Money, 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 money. So that sounds like a lot. And then also at the same time, you are the founder of the Pharma Industry MD Coach, where you help other physicians try to find jobs in biotech pharma. So that's a long intro. I didn't even give you a chance to say what's up. So how you doing, Dr. Narissa?
I'm great. And I love to talk about this career path. So really happy to be able to share it.
Yes. Awesome. So listen, you've been in this industry for about 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. I think a lot of people, at least a lot of physicians, don't see the correlation in terms of their skills and how it correlates into being in pharma. Now, you've been working in this industry for a significant period of time. And I just want to know, when you jumped into medical school and you had a chance to kind of look forward, or if you got a chance to tell the future, did you envision yourself where you are currently in this position?
I did not actually. So I knew early on, probably in residency, at least early in fellowship, that I didn't want to practice clinical medicine day in and day out. But what I thought I wanted to do was clinical research in the academic setting. So I set myself on a path during fellowship, got a master's in clinical research. And um, so I thought I would be in academics, but I just wasn't planning on seeing patients day in and day out. Now I use that clinical research experience in biotech, but it really wasn't exactly what I was thinking early on.
So, in residency or in fellowship, you're having these thoughts. This is 15 years ago. Like, these podcasts are not out. These vlogs are not out. Like, it's not what it is today as it was back then. So what is that conversation that you're having in your head? Who did you lean on? Did you have mentors? Talk us through what you were thinking during that time when you're like, yeah, clinical medicine is not where it's at for me.
Yeah. So, in fellowship, in my pediatric endocrine fellowship, my mentor had a very successful clinical research career and in fact, also had a basic science lab that I worked in as well. And I think at that point, I saw that I could still see patients, but they would be my research patients. And that's what I really enjoyed, that continuity of care from the standpoint of doing it in a research setting. I think the only example I had of someone in pharma was a professor from UCLA, also a pediatric endocrinologist, who had had her full career in academics. And then later in her career, probably in her late 50s or early 60s, had transitioned into the pharmaceutical industry. She was really my only example that I knew of. And so that's what I thought you had to do actually to get into pharma, was have a long career, be an advisor, be a full professor, and then you might be able to transition.
So what was your thoughts when you were thinking that? Did you want to throw up in your mouth?
I mean, I I was very much on the path. Okay, well, maybe that's an option for 20 or 30 years down the road. Right now, I'll focus on being an academic clinical researcher, which for your audience that's, in academics, it's very difficult these days to get grant funding. And so it's a tough road. I probably didn't know that at the time.
So when you get to that point where you're just like, okay, I'm okay. I'm at ease with knowing that clinically, the patients that I want to see have to be related to the research, to the grants, or whatever it may be, research related. These are the type of patients I want to see. What's the next step after that? Because I know that, I've read a little bit about you. I know that you've had to bounce around a little bit after fellowship. What was that next process like, kind of solidifying with yourself? Like, yeah, this is where I want to be. This is what I want to do.
Yeah, so my family was moving to Boston for my husband's fellowship. We were committed to moving, and I thought I had an academic clinical research position at one of the hospitals here in Boston, and that fell through. And so, as you can imagine, young family, were moving, and all of the sudden, the academic research position I thought I had was gone. So I looked around at some other options, and actually one of those options ended up being the biotech industry. And so I really just took a chance because I didn't fully understand what I was getting into, but I knew I didn't want to take a clinical career path as sort of, well, this is the only option to me. So as I was weighing, I don't have a clinical research path in Boston. My options right now are biotech or a clinical career. I decided to kind of take the road less traveled and give it a try, knowing I could go back if it didn't work out.
So you threw your hat in the ring and basically made a resume, and I'm sure you had to change your whole resume because, you're used to this point doing CVs. Because do they even take CVs? They take resumes, right?
Yeah. They want to see resumes. That's actually one of the things I work on with people is converting their CVs to resumes. It's a skill we don't really learn how to do in medical school.
What's the difference? Like 30,000 foot view. What's the difference between a CV and a resume?
Yeah, well, first is length. So I typically say a resume should be no more than 3 pages, ideally two if you can fit. CVs can be 10, 12, 20 pages long. And the other thing is, it's not a bulleted list of your accomplishments, which is what a CV is, right? This is translating your skills on paper so you can sell yourself and sell your expertise.
Whereas a CV is just kind of just listing everything that you've done ever in your entire life,
Exactly.
including even jobs that you've had before medical school. So yeah. So I'm very interested in that. When you submitted your application or you submitted your resume to your first job, how did that go out? Did you get that first position or did you get a couple of no's? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I did. I actually, and this ties to networking, which is one of the skills that's so critical. But the way I landed this role, one of the sales representatives from this company that I landed the job at found out about my situation and was like, just give me your resume. Let me send it to the company. Let's see if there's anything. It would be really awesome to work together. And that's how I got the first job. So it was a very particular situation, and I don't actually tell my clients that you're going to land your first job, even though I did, because they were looking for a pediatric endocrinologist. I'm a
Very
pediatric
specific.
endocrinologist, so it was a very specific need they had. But now my career has gone in a totally different path. I don't practice pediatric endocrinology. I work in a completely different therapeutic area now.
What was the first job that you had?
Yeah, so I was a medical director of medical affairs.
So what does that mean specifically? Like what were you doing? Tell us like kind of the specifics of that.
Yeah, so this ties a little bit to the three most common roles for physicians in pharma,
Ah,
which I think is something that, is the sort of basis of understanding what physicians can do in pharma. So medical affairs is one of them. And medical affairs is the most external facing role of a physician in a pharmaceutical company. So they're taking the science, the clinical research, the basic research that the company is doing, and they're translating externally to physicians in practice. So they might be doing slide decks, they might be helping publish papers. They're typically the physicians that you might meet at a congress because they're there to talk about the science. So that's med affairs or medical affairs. Then there's clinical development. That one's probably the most easy for most people to understand in that they're the physicians that are running the clinical trials. So writing clinical trial protocols, writing all of the safety documents that are required, very involved in the regulatory process to get drugs approved. And then the other is pharmacovigilance or drug safety. So those physicians are fully focused on the safety of the drugs in the pharma industry. And it might be drugs that are already on the market, or it might be drugs that are still in clinical trials and not yet approved. But they're looking at all the safety data coming in and making judgment calls about, is this a related side effect or not? So totally using their clinical knowledge based on the disease process and their understanding of the pharmacology of a drug.
so we said medical liaison. You said, can you give me the names again? The three names
Yeah.
again?
So medical affairs,
Medical affairs.
of
Okay.
which medical science liaisons are a part of medical affairs, then clinical development,
Okay.
and then drug safety, also called pharmacovigilance.
Now, in any of those three positions, for example, if a physician is looking for entry into those positions, is their MD, their DO, is that enough, or should they be looking for additional degrees to jump into that field?
Yeah, very common question. So their degree is enough. And what I tell physicians is think about it. You have more training than most people. You've gone through 4 years of your BS or BA. You've gone through 4 years of med school. Your expertise and clinical training is enough. So most of the roles like medical affairs and pharmacovigilance, you really need your medical training, that disease training and understanding. The one role that it is a little more difficult to jump right into is clinical development. Often companies do want those people to have some kind of research experience.
Okay. Yeah.
But the thing is, physicians think that experience has to be like They've run double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, and they've published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
That's what I was
It's
thinking.
not, yeah, it's not that kind of research experience. So
Okay.
if as a resident, if as a fellow, you were involved in clinical research and you helped as a sub-investigator, maybe you published an abstract from a retrospective case report,
That's it?
that counts as research experience.
What?
It's how you position it. It's
Dr.
how you
Narissa, I'm
position it.
fixing up my CV right, my resume right now. I got a bunch of stuff I was featured
Yeah.
as a co-author on. Hold up.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Being
All
an
right.
author, yeah, yeah. People, it's one of those things. Physicians, we are such high achievers that we don't give ourselves credit for so much of what we've done. And so it really is looking at what is the experience I bring to the table and how do I talk about it? How do I sell it? How do I give myself credit for it?
So how does someone know, like, how do you know what like pharmacy or what pharmaceuticals are companies are looking for, right? Like, because I think that's the other thing that I think doctors struggle with is like, I don't even know what they're looking for. Like, I think that they want someone who's done, like you said, all of these crazy New England Journal of Medicine research, and I had to have created something or have a patent here or what have you. Like, they take the best of the best. Like, what are they looking for specifically from clinical doctors right now?
Yeah. So first, your medical training. And for some of us, although again, I only practiced for 1 year out of fellowship before I had my job, but for some roles, the clinical experience is helpful, but not necessary. And then they're looking for people who can be good colleagues, cross-functional workers. So people who are willing to work on teams. And this is one of the place I think for physicians, it's not exactly what we're used to. We're
Mm,
typically sort of in charge, right? You're
yeah.
running the code and you're the doctor in charge. And in pharma, they're looking for people who want to contribute to the culture, want to be cross-functional players. So there's some humility involved that I think sometimes as physicians, it's just part of our training to be in charge. In pharma, we're looking for people who can work on teams really well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, because there's got to be a big difference between, the training as well as just, practicing as, a full-fledged licensed physician and, in the realm of pharma tech. Like, it seems like you're just part of a team for the most part. Whether you're the head or not, that's, depends on how well your skills are, so to speak. What's the daily schedule like? What are we talking about?
Yeah. So I typically start my day around 8:30. So that's pretty set, right? It's unusual. We have 8 o'clock meetings. We try to protect that time for people. Um, and then the nice thing is most of the work I'm doing can be done at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 9 o'clock at night. It allows for that flexibility of I can read a journal article, I can write a clinical trial protocol at any point in time, right? I don't have a patient waiting for me in the room. So that's one thing. It's very much Monday through Friday, although certainly there have been weeks I've worked on the weekends, but not because I had to be on call, I had to be in the ER, because I chose to work, because maybe I took time to go to my daughter's play at school on Friday afternoon. So a lot of flexibility, no call, which is one of the things that I think is a nice perk, and that very much predictable schedule, right? There's very few emergencies or urgencies that come up in biotech and pharma.
Now, I am interested in the ability to move up, because you've obviously have kind of traversed through all the different roles that I would assume a physician would have in pharma, to where multiple companies you've been the chief medical officer. What is what's the sequence, I guess, to go from the three common positions that you've referenced to getting to where you're at, which is chief medical officer? Like, how does that work? How many years does someone expect to be in the industry to kind of get to your role? How does that work?
Sure. So among each of those roles, the titles typically start for an incoming physician at around associate director or director. And after director is senior director. Some companies then have a title called executive director. Typically, then you're moving into a vice president type role. And depending on how big the company is, they might have associate VP, senior VP, executive VP. And then after VP,
It's a lot
sometimes,
of redundancies almost.
yeah, but it's like it's leveling, right,
Yeah.
of different VP type roles. And then typically chief medical officer. Um, One of the great things about pharma, I think, is that ability to develop yourself and your skills and be promoted. Not everybody's looking for that. A lot of people are happy to stay at a director or senior director level role and be more of an individual contributor than a manager. So that's something that you have to consider. But yeah, that's the typical progression. And, it can take a number of different years. Some of that depends on, are you in a smaller biotech company, which is what I've typically worked in? You have a lot more opportunity for progression and growth. In bigger companies, there are more layers. It's a little more slow to progress, but different companies are good fits for different physicians.
So I read recently in Kevin MD, you did an article there where you talked about being in the industry for over 15 years, and that you've taken 6 different roles, but you've always strategically taken these roles to land a role or aim at being a chief medical officer. Why chief medical officer? Why was that the pinnacle for you?
Yeah, probably ties to some of that high achiever mindset,
Hmm.
but I I truly believe I'm a good leader and a good manager. And so that's where I wanted to focus my career, was being a leader in pharma. And so, as I saw that, the chief medical officer role is the sort of highest role for a physician in pharma. And I decided that that's where I wanted to be, setting those goals. It's the new year coming up, right? So, setting that goal, where do I want to be? And I did strategically take roles that would help round out my experience that I would need for being a chief medical officer.
So when you've gone to different companies, or you've been chief medical officer at different companies, like, talk to us about the mindset of achieving something and then deciding to move to a different company. Is it like a new challenge that you're seeing? Is it a new set of like technology? Like, what makes you want to go from one place to another? Just to kind of prepare the doctors who are listening to know that maybe just staying at one company for the rest of your life, that's not probably realistic, and to kind of hear a little bit and learn a little bit from your decisions.
Yeah. So I think so. I started in medical affairs, and I knew to be a chief medical officer, I really needed to have that clinical development experience in pharma. So that was the first thing I started looking for. As I got into that medical affairs role, I really enjoyed it, and I decided I wanted to stay in pharma. The next thing I started looking for, well, how do I really get that clinical development experience in pharma on my resume? So that was my next step. I won't take you through all of them, but as I did that, I started to realize, okay, there are leadership opportunities. How do I make sure that I start to have direct reports, for example? So that was the next step, was to move into a role where I would have a team below me and be able to
Okay.
develop that leadership skill.
Okay. So are we talking several years in? Are we at this point? Are we talking a year in, 2 years? How long did it take you to get to that point?
Yeah, so I made my first move after a couple of years. I felt like I had really learned as much as I could, and there wasn't a big opportunity to move up at the first company. And so I moved after about 2.5 years. Most of my moves have been within about 3 years, where either there's not an opportunity to move up within the company that's available at the time, or maybe I was looking for, like I talked about earlier, that different therapeutic area experience. So moving out of endocrinology, moving into other things, again, rounding out that experience to make me a more sort of wholesome physician in pharma.
All right, so let's jump into some advice that the audience can learn from. So I think we kind of already established that this is a field that is welcoming of doctors from various backgrounds. Let's talk about what are the first steps that they need to take. So if a doc is listening right now and they're like, "Man, I want to get in on that. I like what she's talking about. I'm all about it." What's the first step that they need to do to enter into this realm?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is they have to have the mindset that this is a possibility for them. I often see physicians just take themselves out of the running before they've even tried
What do you
because
mean?
they believe some of these myths, right? That like I have to have published in New England Journal to
Yes,
get a
yeah.
job in pharma. So come in with the mindset that as a physician, I can get a job in pharma. So that's the first thing. The other is understanding those three roles that we talked about. So that would be one is, what am I interested in? If I look at what are the responsibilities of these three, what am I interested in learning more about? The other, networking. It's not an evil word. It's not a bad thing, right? Networking is important. So you need to reach out to colleagues. You need to reach out to physicians that are working in pharma and ask them to have a coffee, have a chat so that you can learn more and start to build some connections.
Are we when you're networking too? Let's say you don't know anybody who's in pharmacy, right? Or pharmaceuticals. Are we talking maybe Facebook groups? Are we talking, is there a job board? Are we talking like, how does someone really like say, okay, like, I don't know anybody here. How do I do I just give up because I can't? Like, talk to us about that situation.
Right. Yeah. So don't give up.
Mhm.
And my guess is you actually might know someone, right? It's easy to say I don't, but if you go back and look at your medical school alumni, look at your residency alumni, and maybe there actually is someone working in pharma or biotech. So that would be the first thing. LinkedIn is where I suggest people spend all their time networking as well as job searching. It's a one-stop shop. You don't need to go to some of the other job boards. Just spend your time on LinkedIn. There are some great Facebook pages available to physicians. One's called Non-Clinical Careers.
Mhm.
That's a great one to get advice, to be able to connect with those of us working in pharma. So Facebook groups and LinkedIn would be my key places to send people.
Now with LinkedIn, I'm not gonna lie. I think probably most docs are not used to using LinkedIn because we just don't have to, right? Like everything, like you said before, for a physician is laid out. Like if I do well on boards, if I do this residency, and then all of these headhunters are gonna come for me afterwards, or I just go to a job board and I find a job. So when working in LinkedIn, like what's the etiquette we should be looking for? Should we just be let's say we find someone who is let's say they find you, right? Obviously, are they reaching out saying, "Hey, I'm interested in transitioning into pharma. Can you help me, or can you give me advice, or like what's the thing that you are like, yeah, I want to help this person, or this is a good question versus, yeah, this is generic type of questions. This is not going to work." Talk to us about that.
Sure. So I think we have to see networking as not transactional, right? So networking is a relationship building experience. So if you come at it asking a question that shows you've done no research, you've not even, sort of done a Google search to try to find some information, that doesn't really entice me to want to help the person because I don't necessarily feel like they're going to help themselves first. So you want to show initiative, right? And that's what we're going to want in pharma too, are people who are self-starters, they show initiative. So the people that I want to help are the people who say, I've been looking at this, I've read material, I've listened to podcasts, and I have a more specific question. Could I chat with you about this? I think that entices people to want to help.
Got you. Okay, so everyone who's listening, make sure you do a little bit of some research before you contact Dr. Narissa. Make sure you listen to this podcast first and let her know that you've heard this before you contact. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, salary. right? Like, I think that's another fear that people get concerned about. It's like, well, I go to work as a doctor and I'm guaranteed X, Y, and Z. I'm going to have to work weekends. I'm going to probably have to work holidays, but at least I know I show up and I get this. Like, what's the scoop with working in the pharma industry, particularly in those 3 roles that you're talking about? You don't have to give us exact numbers, but what are we talking about?
Yeah. So generally speaking, for the non-procedural and non-surgical physicians, pharma can be actually more competitive. So a going in salary for most physicians at sort of that associate director level is somewhere in the mid 200s to high 200s.
Say that again?
Yeah, mid to high 200s.
So it's very comparable, actually.
Actually very comparable. And, if you think about some of our physician colleagues, it's more. Now, importantly, that's the base salary. There's an annual bonus that's some percentage of that base salary that typically, again, 15% would be on the low side, all the way up to 25, 30%. So that's on top of that base salary. 3 to 4 weeks of vacation. Actually, for example, this week my company is closed, and that's not a week that counts towards my vacation. We're just closed. There's a shutdown. I'm not on call. I'm not getting emails. So for that salary, there is a lot of flexibility. And I think the other thing, Nii, is that there's progression, right? So as a physician, our going in salaries, yes, you can change as you get more senior, but in small increments generally, right? In pharma, the increments are bigger. So as you take on bigger and bigger titles, the salaries get bigger with them.
So everyone listening, so the opportunities are abundant, I would say. Right, the opportunities are abundant, and for folks right now who feel like, well, maybe I'd like to learn more about this, and maybe I'd like to interact with Dr. Narissa Moore. I know that you coach physicians on how to get into this field the right way. So, do you want to take a moment to talk about your coaching program?
Sure. So you can find me at industrymdcoach.com. I started doing this because of the questions I was getting, right? So I saw physicians struggling, not understanding. And so I decided I can help these people. So my business is really consulting and coaching. The consulting part is walking you step by step through the process. The questions about how do I use LinkedIn? How do I write a resume? Where do I find the jobs? What companies should I look for? So more tactical walking you through. But the other piece is that coaching piece, right? The mindset of how do I go at this with a mindset that's positive? I can achieve this. So it's that balance really of both consulting and coaching built into one.
Okay. All right. So you folks, y'all, so you guys hear that we will put the links in the show notes for people to learn more about your program and to hopefully interact with you. But there it is, guys. There is an opportunity for us all to work in the pharmaceutical land. I think definitely my thought process was, well, I haven't put out any research or, I haven't done any bench work. So there's really no place for me to be there. And you definitely changed my mind and hopefully changed the mind of a lot of listeners on the show also. So Dr. Narissa, thank you so much for coming on Docs Outside the Box.
Thanks so much.
That's a wrap, y'all. Once again, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Narissa for coming on Docs Outside the Box. Like I said, we haven't featured this type of career path on the show before. We've kind of talked about it on the periphery, but never really had someone talk about it on this show. So once again, shout out to you, Dr. Narissa. Before you jet, though, I got some key takeaways that I want y'all to get. One is trusting your gut. When you know, you know. And as you heard earlier, Dr. Narissa knew very early on in her career that clinical medicine, it wasn't there for her. That's not where it was at. And she didn't want to take care of her patients in this specific way. She knew exactly, or she was pretty close to knowing how she wanted to take care of her patients, but she didn't know exactly how to get there. And she figured it out over time, right? And the key thing is that you got to trust your gut. You got to be open with yourself. And look, I mean, in my career as a resident, and I can even think back as a medical student, there were definitely attendings, there were definitely superiors who, like at one point there was a fork in the road for them and they went left when they should have went right. And maybe the reason why they are very difficult to deal with, maybe the reason why they're assholes, maybe the reason why they are crotchety is because there was a fork in the road and they took the wrong turn, right? So you don't want to be that person. You want to be very honest with yourself, and you want to surround yourself with positive people who are doing something very similar, and some people who are going to encourage you to say, hey, it is okay. And that leads me to my next point of taking the road less traveled, right? If you haven't seen it done before, or if you've seen very few people do it, it could be really scary, right? But I always say, always go back to the accomplishments that you've had before. If you can do step 1, you can definitely do step 2. And look, if you can make it in whatever professional career that you are in right now, if you're in medical school, whatever it may be, law school, engineering, if you can get to that point where you're that successful, taking the road less traveled can't be so scary. And that's the point of this show, is to expose you all to other doctors who kind of faced very similar type of forks in the road, and they decided to take the road less traveled, and now they're thriving because of it, right? And it's for us to have this little safe space where we can listen, interview, and really understand how certain people are able to see fear and actually move past it or move around it, whichever way you want to do, but they're not staying in one place, right? They're moving forward. And that's what I got to give props to Dr. Narissa for. The other thing that I learned also is CV versus resume, right? I never knew up until this episode there was a difference. I kind of knew there was a difference, but I didn't really know. So remember, a CV is a list of accomplishments, whereas a resume is taking those accomplishments, taking those skills that you have and really formatting it in a way that will make you very attractive to an employer. Okay, so CV, list of accomplishments, the medical school you went to, the residency, the fellowship, papers, published, things that got published, clubs that you're in. A resume is taking everything that you've learned in those previous examples, putting them as skills and making it 1 to 2 pages, presenting that to an employer and making you as attractive as possible. And last but not least, y'all, is just remember that you got a lot to offer. You guys are all dope. If you're able to get to this point where you're even listening to this podcast, there's a reason why you're listening to this podcast, right? Think about all the things that you've gone through in your professional career, as well as if you are in medicine, think about all the things that you had to understand, right? It's really valuable, right? Understanding organic chemistry, even though you hated it or you just did it to get through, it's still valuable, right? Because you are able to apply that to actual patients, to patient care. Physics, mad valuable. Biochemistry, physiology, all of those different things are very valuable to executives, to scientists in the pharma field, and you've got that knowledge. So don't shy away from it. That's the whole point of what Dr. Narissa was saying, is that you can take all of these skills that very few people have, and you can really succeed in this world of pharma. So with that, I'm going to leave it at that, guys. Thank you once again for listening to this episode of Docs Outside the Box. As always, make sure you text me. Let me know what you think about the show. Or if not, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode. Peace.